Welcome to Attic Raiders Retro Reviews, where today we're going to be entering into a world of magic as we continue our process of painting up the playing pieces from HeroQuest. Today we're going to be painting up the mummies. Now these guys are wrapped from head to foot in old bandages, so there's not going to be an awful lot of colour variation on them. That said, I absolutely love the sculpt on these miniatures. Out of all the miniature mummies that I've seen from different companies, these are my absolute favourites. They're such a classic pose and look. I've always found ancient Egyptian style mummies to be a bit of an odd inclusion in a dungeon crawler such as HeroQuest, but I really do like these guys. They look good. So let's see if our painting can do them justice. Let's get started. Now usually when you're painting miniatures you're going to want to primer them first. However, I've not done that in this case. I find with the old Games Workshop plastic, it's not really necessary. Paint does stick to them pretty well and it doesn't flake or chip off or rub off. The new plastic that miniatures are made from, the kind of bendy plastic that miniatures are made from nowadays, and definitely metal miniatures, now they need primer, but this old plastic, it doesn't really need the primer for the paint to stick to it, and I've never had any problem with paint rubbing off of them. So for this, because it's the colour that I really want for the mummy, I'm just going to put a shade straight onto it. So with that Agrax wash in the deep crevices, giving some nice depth, I'm going to go in and add some more colour onto the bandages here. I'm using a beige and I'm dry brushing this. So most of the paint has been brushed off of my paintbrush onto a piece of newspaper, leaving just a little bit on the brush, and I'm running that across the raised areas so that it's only being left on those high points. And that means that it's not going to go into those areas where that wash has settled, and it's going to give that nice beige mummy wrapping bandage colour. Of course, that's not quite there yet, so I'm going to go in with a lighter colour, in this case Wraithbone from Citadel, and again I'm dry brushing, very little paint on my brush, going over those raised spots, going against the grain of the bandages, so I'm running it over the highlighted areas, not using as much as when I did the beige, but just kind of picking out those raised areas to get a bit more colour and three-dimensionality onto them. And that's it pretty much there, but I just want to punch it up a little bit more. So I'm going in with some pure white here. I'm being very sparse with this. Hardly any of the white is left on the brush with the dry brushing here. I just want to pick out those tiny little highlights just to punch up the colour and make them brighter and more readable on the tabletop. And you'll find if you do this dry brushing method instead of painting individual bandages by hand, you get a really nice natural result, and it's much faster. But you can get a little bit of that dry brush paint into the crevices where you don't want it, but it's quite easy. We're just going to go back with a little bit of that Earthshade and carefully paint it into those crevices where that whiter shade shouldn't be, and just cover it up. With the bandages done, I'm now looking at the decayed flesh which is showing through the gaps between the bandages, and for this I'm just using a very fine tipped brush and some grey in order to lay down a grey base layer that I can put some washes on top of to bring out some of that detail. Of course, the exposed flesh on the mummy can be found on the face, on the shoulder, and on the fingers on the hand. It's debatable as well whether or not the knee should be painted as exposed flesh. The painted prototype sculpt, which can be seen on the side of the box, has definitely got the knee painted, but that sculpt is slightly different from what was produced and released with the game. So I'm not really sure whether the knee should be painted or not, because to me it looks more like a bandage covering the knee rather than sculpted exposed flesh. But you could of course do it whichever way you want, and in the past when I've painted these before as green flesh, then I have painted that knee green as well. Now when it comes to actually colouring the decayed skin of the mummy, you've obviously got a range of options. If you're going for realistic like ancient Egyptian mummies, then it should probably be a shade of brown leathery skin, but I find that that doesn't particularly read very well on a tabletop, so I like to use brighter colours. Green is another good option for decay, but I find with so many orcs and goblins and Famir on the HeroQuest game, there's a lot of green already on the tabletop, so I like to change it up a little bit. So for this I'm going for blue, more of the Thundercats Mumra skin coloration. So for that I'm taking this Citadel shade, this Drakenhof Nightshade, and applying it very, very finely with a fine tipped brush over the top of the grey painted skin so that it settles into the crevices of those detail areas and brings out some more colour to it, but also gives it some more depth. That's a nice blue in the depth of the skin now, but I really want to punch it up with some highlighting. So for this I'm using some Teclis blue and just painting carefully over the raised areas using a fine tipped brush, going back over the flesh on the shoulder and the exposed flesh on the face, around the jaw and on the top of the face, the forehead, just picking out those raised areas like the jawbone and across the forehead bones, down the middle of the nose and around the eye bones. And highlighting the cheekbones really does add that contrast, making the eye sockets look much deeper and more hollow looking, like it would be in this undead creature. From there is a little bit of Evil Sunz Scarlet for those glowing red eyes, and I'll come back and highlight these to add in a bit more glowing colour, but again, fine tip brush, just being really careful. And I really want this miniature to read well when it's on the table being played with, so I'm adding even more highlights, taking that Teclis blue but mixing it with a little bit of grey, which is a really light grey, so that I've got a really bright light colour, and again going over very finely those highlight points, those raised points where it's going to be the most light shining on them, just to really give a bit more depth and brightness to the skin. And now that that red has properly dried, I'm adding a tiny dot of bright yellow into the center of each eye, just to make it really look like it's glowing, like this undead creature has been brought to life with this unearthly magic. And mummy done, it's time for the base, and like all of my HeroQuest miniatures, I'm using Humbrol Metalcote polished steel. Now this is really nice paint. It goes on, it's a bit tricky the way it goes on, because as it starts to dry it really does lift easily if it's in the midpoint of drying, so you've got to work with it quite quickly while it's still liquid. But once you've got it down, you can start dabbing it on and stippling it and bringing it up, breaking up that surface and actually creating a nice texture just with the paint without having to add anything to it. And I find that it adds a nice something to the base, so that there's an extra little bit of interest, but without adding too much that you're taking away from the overall miniature itself. And then finally, once that paint's dry, just using a soft disposable cloth to rub it back and forth really quickly in order to buff it up, because the Metalcote paint from Humbrol is specially designed so that it dries to this matte, dark look, but when you actually buff it, it goes really shiny and catches the light, and it's just a really nice look which works well.
and I think that adds some nice visual interest, especially with that slight texture and the shine, but without being overpowering and taking away from the game piece itself. And there we have it. You can see here the two mummies at the front with the blue skin tone are the two that I've just painted up using this paint color guide. The four at the back I painted previously. You can see I've used a green skin tone for those, and also rather than using the Agrax Earthshade as a wash, I've used a much lighter brown color, so they're much lighter overall. It depends what you want to do, and I just like having that slight difference with the mummies, so you can have a lighter brown color which gives a much cleaner bandage look, or the darker Agrax.
So I hope you found that useful. If you'd like to tell us how you get on with painting, please leave a message in the comments below, or if you've got any of your own tips or tricks that you'd like to share, please get in touch. Please remember to like and subscribe if you've enjoyed what you've seen here, and there's going to be plenty more of this coming up. Until next time though, this is Attic Raiders Retro Reviews.